Just think of this. You step outside your hut in January, sometime around the year 1350, the world is silent, the snow has buried the fields, the rivers are frozen, and the wind howls like a beast. You pull your rough wool cloak tighter around your shoulders, but it does little to stop the cold that seeps through everything: your skin, your bones, even your thoughts. There is no central heating, no grocery store, no modern comfort. Survival is a daily gamble. Every breath feels sharp in your chest. Every night is a test against hunger, sickness, and death. For medieval peasants, winter was not just a season, it was an enemy, a force of nature that stripped away the weak, punished the unprepared, and reminded everyone of their smallness in the face of creation. Tonight, we will journey back into this world. We will explore the brutal winters of the Middle Ages, what people ate, how they built their homes, the rituals they turned to for protection, and the terrifying consequences of famine and disease. This is not a story of knights and castles, but of ordinary men, women, and children, fighting to see the spring. So, settle in. This is history in its slow, unvarnished truth. This is how medieval peasants survived brutal winters, the endless cold. The first thing to understand about winter in the Middle Ages is that it felt endless. From late November until March, the world was locked in frost. In northern Europe, days were short, nights long, and warmth fleeting. Most peasant huts were little more than timber frames packed with mud and straw, with a thatched roof overhead. Insulation was minimal. The moment the fire burned low, the cold crept in again. Peasants often slept together in one room, parents, children, and sometimes even livestock huddled close to share body heat. The animals, especially pigs and chickens, served not only as food for later but as living heaters. Imagine lying down to sleep beside your family, the smoky air heavy with the scent of hay, sweat, and animals. Your only comfort a rough wool blanket that barely kept out the chill. In the morning, the water bucket might be frozen solid. Bread left out overnight could harden into something like stone. Even washing yourself was an ordeal, since there was little point in heating water that would go cold almost immediately. For weeks and months, peasants lived in a state of constant shivering, conserving energy, waiting for the return of warmth. The hunger season. Winter was also called the hunger season. Food had to be carefully rationed, because the harvest was long past and spring planting was still months away. Peasants relied on whatever they had stored from autumn. Grain was the most important. Rye, barley, and oats were stored in sacks and used to make bread, porridge, and gruel. Bread was coarse, dark, and sometimes stretched with fillers like ground acorns, chestnuts, or even sawdust if times were desperate. Meat was rare in winter. Most animals could not be fed through the cold months, so they were slaughtered in autumn, and the meat was salted, smoked, or dried for storage. By midwinter, much of it would already be gone. What remained was often tough, salty, and barely edible. Vegetables like onions, turnips, and cabbage could be stored in root cellars, buried underground where the cold was stable. But fresh greens were impossible to find. Scurvy, weakness, and malnutrition were constant threats. And then, of course, there were the years when harvests failed entirely. A bad summer, a wet autumn, or an early frost could mean famine. In such years, peasants boiled bark, chewed grass, or made bread from ground-up beanstalks. Some chronicles even whisper of cannibalism in the worst winters, though these accounts are rare and often cloaked in moral outrage. To be a medieval peasant in winter was to live with an empty stomach, always measuring how much food was left, always fearing that it might not last until spring. Fire and smoke. Fire was the center of survival. Every peasant hut had a hearth, often just a shallow pit in the center of the dirt floor. There was no chimney in most early huts, only a hole in the roof where smoke escaped slowly, filling the room with a thick haze. Children coughed, eyes watered, but the fire was life itself. Wood had to be gathered in autumn and stacked carefully to last through winter. But wood was heavy, and peasants often had limited rights to forests. Lords controlled most woodland, and peasants who took too much could be fined or punished. As a result, many families burned dung, dried into patties, as fuel. The smell was unpleasant, but it kept the hearth alive. The fire was not just for heat, it was also the stove. Soups, stews, and porridges simmered slowly, sometimes for days, with new ingredients tossed in whenever available. A pot of stew might never be fully emptied, but simply replenished, becoming a strange mix of flavors and textures, known as perpetual stew. But even with fire, warmth was fragile. The moment a storm blew in and the wind cut through the cracks of the walls, the cold returned. The hearth became the battlefield against winter, and many peasants lost. Clothing against the cold. Peasant clothing was simple, but in winter it became the difference between life and death. Wool was the primary material, coarse, itchy, but warm. Cloaks, hoods, and mittens were all fashioned from it. Underneath, peasants wore linen shifts or tunics. Though linen offered little insulation, shoes were crude leather, sometimes stuffed with straw for added warmth. In deep snow, feet froze quickly, and frostbite was a common danger. Children especially suffered, since they often wore hand-me-downs or went barefoot indoors. Wealthier peasants might line their clothing with fur from rabbits, squirrels, or foxes, but for most, this was a luxury out of reach. Instead, layers were the secret multiple tunics, cloaks, and wraps bound tightly to keep out the wind. Still, the cold found its way in. Chroniclers write of peasants with fingers blackened from frostbite, or of old people who never woke after a particularly cold night. Clothing helped, but it was not enough. The body was always at war with winter. Shelter in straw and mud. The medieval peasant's home was never built with winter in mind. Most huts were simple constructions, timber frames with walls made of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mix of mud, clay, and dung. In summer, such homes were bearable. In winter, they became little more than cold boxes. The thatched roof, while impressive from a distance, leaked under the weight of snow or driving sleet. The floor was often nothing more than packed earth, damp and freezing to the touch. Rats scurried in the straw bedding, and insects burrowed into the thatch overhead, dropping down even in the dead of winter. But peasants adapted. They layered straw thickly across the floor to act as insulation. Families often stuffed cracks in the walls with moss, rags, or more mud. It was not perfect, but every little effort helped keep out the wind. The inside of a hut was dark. There were no glass windows, only shutters that could be opened in daylight, or closed tight at night. With smoke from the hearth swirling and animals crowded inside, the air was thick and acrid. Yet this humble hut was still a fortress against the deadlier force outside, the merciless cold. It is difficult for us to imagine today. But for peasants, survival depended not on comfort, but on resilience. They were not building dream homes, they were building shelters, barely enough to keep death at bay. Work that never ended. Winter might seem like a season of rest, when fields were frozen and farming halted. But for peasants, work never truly stopped. Men spent much of the winter repairing tools, sharpening scythes, mending carts, and shaping new handles for plows. Iron was expensive, so wooden replacements were common. Every task was done by hand, in the dim light of the hearth, with crude tools that required endless effort. Women spun wool into yarn, mended clothing, and wove cloth on simple looms. They also brewed ale, which was safer to drink than water and provided crucial calories. Brewing was time-consuming, but in winter it was one of the few lifelines of nutrition. Children helped in every way they could. They collected firewood, tended animals, or sat in the dim light picking apart old rags to salvage thread. Even elderly peasants were not idle. Those too weak for heavy work could carve wooden spoons, stitch leather patches, or help dry herbs for medicine. Winter was also a season for making things that could not be made during the rush of spring and summer. Rope, baskets, shoes, and tools were crafted in long hours around the fire. This ensured that when the thaw came, the family was ready to work the fields again. Idleness was dangerous. In a time when every item had value, when every stitch of clothing or wooden handle might make the difference between life and death, winter was not an escape from labor. It was merely a change of tasks. The winter diet, ale, bread, and hope. While the hunger season loomed, peasants had a survival strategy, stretching small amounts of food as far as possible. Bread was the foundation of every meal. Coarse, dense loaves of rye or barley bread could last for weeks if kept dry. To soften stale bread, it was often soaked in broth, ale, or milk, creating a kind of porridge. Sometimes a family's entire diet was nothing but this bread and liquid mixture. Ale was essential. Even weak ale contained calories and was safer to drink than river water, which could spread disease. Children drank it too, though theirs was heavily diluted. For many peasants, ale was not a luxury, but a necessity. In rare moments, there were treats: honey, if available, sweetened porridge, nuts and dried fruits, gathered in autumn, might be rationed sparingly through the winter. Salted fish was prized, especially in regions near the coast or rivers. But food was never certain. When the pantry dwindled, desperation grew. By February or March, the hungry gap began, the final stretch before spring harvests. It was then that peasants suffered the most. When bread ran thin, ale supplies were low, and children began to grow weak. Hope was as important as food. To survive winter was not just about calories, but about faith that spring would come, and the world would turn green again. Illness and the cold. Winter was not only about hunger, it was also about sickness. The cold brought fevers, coughs, and infections that spread quickly in cramped huts. Without modern medicine, even a simple cold could spiral into pneumonia. Mothers feared for their children when coughs lingered too long, and elderly peasants often did not survive a harsh winter. Food shortages weakened immune systems. Malnutrition left peasants vulnerable to winter fevers and other diseases. Some suffered from ergotism, poisoning caused by fungus in rye bread stored improperly in damp huts. Symptoms included convulsions, hallucinations, and even death. Then there were the outbreaks waves of influenza, dysentery, or the dreaded plague, which struck in cycles throughout the medieval world. Winter, with its crowded living conditions and poor sanitation, was a perfect breeding ground for disease. Healing was left to folk remedies. Herbs like garlic, sage, and nettles were brewed into teas. Warm compressors were used to fight fevers. Some families relied on charms, prayers, or the blessing of a priest. Others whispered of witches who could heal or curse depending on their favor. Illness in winter was terrifying. There were no hospitals for peasants, no trained doctors. Survival depended on luck, the body's strength, and the community's ability to care for its weakest. The weight of darkness. Beyond hunger and sickness, winter brought another enemy, the darkness. Days were short, nights long. In December and January, the sun might rise late and set by mid-afternoon. Candlelight was scarce. Candles were expensive and made of tallow, producing smoke and foul smells. Most families reserved them for special occasions. Instead, peasants lived in shadow. The hearth provided some light, but in the corners of the hut, darkness reigned. Work was done slowly, eyes strained by dim light. Children played quietly in the gloom, while adults spoke in hushed tones. The darkness also carried fear. Peasants believed winter nights were haunted by spirits. Wolves howled in the forests, and owls, seen as omens of death, screeched in the distance. Stories of witches and demons were told by the fire, reminding children that evil lurked beyond the door. This constant darkness wore on the mind. Some chronicles describe peasants as becoming sluggish or melancholy, weighed down by months of dim skies and long nights. In a world where religion framed every event, many saw winter as a spiritual trial, a season where God tested their endurance, or where the devil stalked those who despaired. It was not only the body that fought to survive winter, but also the spirit. Festivals of survival. Despite the hardships, winter was not entirely grim. Festivals punctuated the season, offering joy, faith, and moments of escape. Christmas was celebrated, though not with modern excess. Peasants attended mass, sang hymns, and shared whatever food could be spared. In some villages, lords gave small gifts of bread or ale to their tenants, a symbolic gesture of goodwill. Then came the Feast of Epiphany, marking the visit of the Magi. In some regions, peasants baked Twelfth Night cakes and celebrated with singing and games. For a brief moment, the hunger and cold were set aside in favor of laughter. Candlemas in February brought another ritual, the blessing of candles, symbolizing light returning to the world. Peasants took comfort in these rituals, believing they helped protect the home from the evils of winter. And of course, there was Carnival, the wild days before Lent. Even in the darkest season, peasants danced, drank, and mocked authority, knowing that soon the fasting of Lent would begin. Carnival was a release valve, a way to laugh at hardship before enduring another round of deprivation. Festivals were survival tools in their own right. They reminded peasants that life was not only toil and hunger, but also joy and community. Even in the coldest months, the human spirit demanded celebration. Fire, the fragile heart of winter life. The hearth was not simply a place to cook, it was the very center of survival. Without fire, a peasant family would not endure even a few days of winter. Starting a fire was no small task. Matches did not exist, and flint with steel was the common method, producing sparks that caught on dried moss, straw, or cloth. Once a fire was lit, it was guarded fiercely. Letting it die meant long, grueling work to rekindle it, and in the dead of winter, perhaps freezing while doing so. Wood was the fuel of life. Families gathered it year-round, piling logs and branches in anticipation of winter. Poorer peasants often had to scavenge, stealing twigs and kindling from lordly forests, risking fines or even corporal punishment. But the hearth was also dangerous. Sparks could ignite straw roofs or bedding. Entire villages sometimes went up in flames, the fire spreading from one wattle and or hut to the next. Still, fire was warmth. It roasted meat when available, boiled broth to soften bread, and provided the only light through long winter evenings. Families clustered close to it, huddling together on benches and stools, their shadows flickering on the mud walls. The hearth was sacred. Ashes were believed to hold protective power, sprinkled at thresholds to keep evil spirits away. Mothers whispered prayers when feeding logs to the fire, as if begging the flames to keep their children alive. Without fire, a peasant hut was nothing but a tomb. With it there was a fighting chance. The lord's demands never slept. Winter did not grant peasants a reprieve from their lords. Obligations continued, sometimes even harsher than in summer. Manorial dues were still expected, rent in the form of grain, eggs, or livestock. If the harvest had been poor, paying these dues left families with dangerously little to eat. Lords were not always merciful. Failure to pay could mean seizure of land or punishment in the manor court. Beyond rents, there were duties, forced labor for the lord. Peasants might be ordered to mend hedges, repair roads, or cut timber for the manor. These tasks dragged them from their own homes at the very time they most needed to focus on survival. The church, too, demanded its share. The tithe, 1/10 of produce, was expected, regardless of famine or hardship. Even in the dead of winter, priests reminded peasants of their spiritual debts. To be a peasant in winter was not only to fight the cold, it was to endure the unrelenting weight of authority. Lords and priests alike insisted their needs came first. And so, while children coughed by the hearth and bread ran thin, the peasant trudged onward, balancing duty to survival with duty to those who claimed his labor. Winter warfare of the poor. Though peasants rarely fought in great wars, they still lived with constant danger. Winter sharpened the threat. Wolves prowled closer to villages, desperate for food. Chronicles describe entire packs descending upon livestock pens, carrying off sheep or goats, while peasants shouted and hurled stones. In lean years, some wolves even attacked travelers or children. Then there were bandits, harsh winters bred desperate men, outlaws, who haunted forests and roads, preying on peasants traveling for trade or gathering wood. Some were starving villagers turned criminal, others were discharged soldiers with no means to live. But the poor fought back in their own way. Villagers organized night watches, taking turns guarding the livestock. Men carried cudgels and pitchforks. Women banged pots to scare off raiders. There were no knights patrolling for their safety. Peasants defended themselves as best they could. Even nature seemed an enemy. Snowstorms could cut off entire hamlets for weeks, leaving peasants isolated and starving. Roofs collapsed under heavy snow, crushing families inside. When rivers froze, trade halted, and villagers lived in terrifying isolation, each family alone with its dwindling food. To survive winter was to fight a war not against kings or knights, but against hunger, beasts, bandits, and the weight of nature itself. Children in the cold. The youngest suffered most in winter. Children had no sturdy shoes, only leather scraps tied around their feet. Their clothing was thin, often hand-me-downs patched so many times they were more stitched than fabric. To keep warm, children often slept huddled together under animal skins. They were expected to work, even in freezing weather. They fetched water from wells, collected firewood, and tended the animals. The youngest herded geese or chickens, while older children helped mend tools or weave cloth. Illness struck them quickly. Malnutrition stunted their growth, and winter fevers carried many away before they reached adulthood. For a peasant family, the death of a child was a common grief, one endured with grim resignation. And yet, children also brought life to winter. Their laughter around the hearth, their excitement at Christmas feasts, and their songs during festivals reminded adults that joy still existed. Parents told stories to keep their spirits alive, tales of saints, monsters, and heroes that taught resilience. Winter was cruelest to the smallest, yet without them, there was no hope for the village's future. Women's burdens. For peasant women, winter was unrelenting labor. They rose before dawn, stoking the fire and preparing whatever food was left. They spun wool and flax endlessly, their hands red and cracked from cold. They patched clothing, scrubbed pots, and cared for children, all while managing household survival. Women also tended the animals, milking cows, feeding pigs, collecting eggs. In winter, this meant trudging into the cold, breaking ice in water troughs, and ensuring livestock did not freeze. Medical care often fell to women. They brewed herbal remedies, dressed wounds, and cared for the sick. Midwives were vital, especially when childbirth struck in the dead of winter, when survival for mother and child was precarious. Yet women also carried social weight. They managed gossip, fostered community ties, and held families together with faith and determination. a woman's ability to stretch food, mend endlessly, and endure sleepless nights often determined whether a household made it through winter. While men's labor was seen in the fields, women's work in winter was the hidden backbone of survival. Faith in the freeze. Religion shaped how peasants understood winter. Every hardship was seen as part of God's plan. Hunger was a test, sickness a trial, and survival a reward for faith. Priests preached that endurance in winter purified souls for heaven. Superstition intertwined with faith. Peasants feared witches who could curse cows or sour ale. They hung charms of rowan wood or blessed herbs to ward off evil. Candlemas candles were carried home to protect against storms. The church calendar structured time. Feasts and fasts broke the monotony of long months. Confession and prayer gave peasants a sense of control, even when nature itself seemed hostile. In darkness, faith was light. Belief in divine order gave peasants meaning, turning survival from mere endurance into a spiritual journey. Entertainment in the gloom. Despite hardship, peasants found ways to amuse themselves. Storytelling was central. By firelight, elders recited tales of saints, heroes, and tricksters. Folktales warned of spirits that haunted the woods or rewarded kindness. These stories were entertainment, and moral lessons rolled into one. Music was common. Simple flutes, drums, and fiddles accompanied singing. Even children clapped and danced in the cramped huts. Festivals brought more elaborate performances, with jesters or traveling musicians lifting spirits. Games were played too. Dice, board games like Nine Men's Morris, or simple contests of strength. In winter, these diversions were not frivolous, they kept despair at bay. Entertainment was survival. Laughter and song warmed the soul when fire and food ran low. Trade and winter markets. Even in the depths of winter, trade was essential. Markets continued, though less frequent. Peasants trudged through snow to nearby villages, bringing eggs, cloth, or firewood to barter for salt, iron, or grain. Winter fairs were highlights of the season. In some towns, frozen rivers became roads, allowing carts to cross where bridges were impassable. These fairs were not only for trade but for celebration, with jugglers, merchants, and priests blessing the new year. For peasants, trade was survival. A few coins earned at a winter fair could buy enough salt to preserve meat, or enough grain to stretch through the hungry months. But markets were also dangerous. Bandits lurked along roads, and exposure during travel was a constant threat. To trade in winter was to risk life for bread. Death in winter. Winter was a season of death. Graves were dug in frozen ground, often with great difficulty. In some regions, bodies were kept in storage until the earth thawed. Funerals were simple, yet deeply symbolic. Priests blessed the dead, and villagers gathered to mourn. Death was familiar but never easy. Hunger claimed the weak. Illness took children and elders. Entire families sometimes perished during harsh winters, and yet death was seen as part of the cycle of life. Winter claimed its toll, but spring always promised renewal. For peasants, mourning was tempered by faith that their loved ones had gone to a better place. Spring, the end of trial. When spring finally broke, survival felt miraculous. The first shoots of green brought relief. Livestock grazed again, milk flowed, and fields were prepared for planting. Hunger faded as new food appeared: nettles, wild garlic, fresh eggs. But survival was not celebration alone. The toll of winter lingered. Families mourned lost children, rebuilt fallen roofs, and began the endless labor of planting anew. For peasants, winter was not simply a season, it was a battle. To endure it meant to prove resilience, faith, and strength. And as the earth thawed, the peasant looked forward not with rest, but with renewed labor. For survival was never a victory to be celebrated long, it was simply the beginning of the next struggle. The peasant's winter diet. Food was the greatest struggle of winter. By November, fresh produce was gone. What remained were stores of salted pork, smoked fish, dried beans, and whatever grain had been harvested. Bread dominated the diet. But by winter's end, grain supplies often ran low. Families mixed flour with oats, rye, or even ground up acorns to stretch it further. This bread was coarse, bitter, and barely nutritious, but it filled the stomach. Vegetables came in the form of preserved cabbages, turnips, or onions, often pickled or stored in cellars. Meat was rare, usually eaten only on feast days or in times of celebration. More often, bones were boiled again and again to flavor thin broth. Dairy products, milk, cheese, butter helped greatly, though they were scarce in winter when cows produced less. Eggs were fewer too, since hens laid little in the cold. Hunger haunted every family. Many peasants deliberately underate rationing food so that children and the elderly would survive. A mother would feed her children and go to bed hungry herself, whispering prayers that spring would come soon. The peasant winter diet was not about nutrition, it was about endurance. Clothing against the cold. A peasant's wardrobe was meager, but every scrap mattered in winter. Wool was the main defense against freezing weather. Tunics, cloaks, and hose were all fashioned from rough-spun wool, often scratchy and uncomfortable. Furs were precious. Rabbit, fox, or even sheepskin-lined cloaks when available. Layers were key. A linen shirt under wool, with an outer cloak pinned by a brooch or simply tied with cord. Peasants stuffed straw or moss into boots for insulation. Children sometimes wore sacks over their clothing for extra warmth. Clothing was patched endlessly. Holes were sewn with coarse thread, and garments passed down through generations until they were nothing but rags. In wealthier households, fur-lined caps and leather gloves provided some comfort, but for most peasants, winter meant numb fingers, frostbitten toes, and red raw skin. Even so, clothing carried meaning. The ability to dress warmly was a mark of survival, and cloaks or furs were treasured family possessions, guarded as carefully as food. Livestock in winter. Animals were lifelines for peasants, but keeping them alive in winter was a battle of its own. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk, wool, and meat, but they required fodder, which meant peasants had to store hay, oats, and root vegetables for months ahead. A poor harvest could mean starvation not only for humans, but for the animals that kept them alive. Livestock were often kept in the same huts as families, separated by a wooden partition. Their body heat warmed the home, though the smell was overwhelming. Chickens and pigs were easier to maintain, but pigs especially were often slaughtered in early winter. The meat was salted or smoked to last months. This grim necessity meant saying goodbye to animals that had been raised by hand. Diseases spread quickly in cramped, damp barns. A plague among sheep or cattle could devastate a village economy overnight. Animals were more than property, they were survival incarnate. To lose livestock was to face hunger and ruin. Winter weddings and family life. While harsh, winter also brought moments of celebration, particularly weddings. With harvest completed and food preserved, late autumn and winter were popular times for marriage. Weddings were modest among peasants, but filled with joy. Ale flowed, bread was shared, and dancing warmed frozen feet. Marriages were not only personal unions, they were survival strategies. A strong spouse meant more labor for the household, and new in-laws meant new alliances. Inside the home, winter family life was intimate. With little work to do in frozen fields, families spent more time together, telling stories, mending tools, and preparing for spring. But confinement also bred tension. Disputes between relatives festered in close quarters. Poverty magnified quarrels over food, chores, and responsibilities. Still, family bonds were essential. Winter was too brutal to survive alone. Kinship and cooperation were the glue that held peasants together when hunger and cold threatened to tear them apart. Winter justice and manor courts. Even in winter, law and order did not rest. Manor courts convened year-round, often inside halls warmed by fires. Peasants were required to attend, even trudging through snow to answer charges of theft, disputes over land, or failure to perform duties. Winter crimes were common. Hungry peasants stole firewood, poached rabbits, or took grain from a neighbor's store. These acts were born of desperation, but the law was rarely merciful. Fines, beatings, or public shame were handed out to keep order. Some punishments were harsher in winter. A thief driven from the village faced not only disgrace but freezing death in the wilderness. The courts reinforced authority, reminding peasants that even in their most desperate season, the bonds of law and hierarchy were unbreakable. Seasonal work and idle hands. With fields frozen, peasants turned to other tasks. Craftwork thrived in winter. Men repaired plows, sharpened tools, and carved wooden utensils. Women spun wool and flax, wove cloth, and made garments. Children helped by twisting rope or mending nets. Idle time was rare, but when it came, it was often filled with prayer, storytelling, or simple rest. Some peasants carved charms to protect against evil, while others whittled toys for children. Still, idleness was feared. Idle hands, priests warned, are the devil's workshop. Villagers were encouraged to keep busy, for both spiritual and practical reasons. A broken tool or torn garment left unattended could mean disaster come spring. Thus, winter was not only a time of waiting, it was a time of preparation, ensuring that when the thaw came, peasants were ready to labor once more. Winter diseases and the village healer. Cold did not prevent sickness in many ways, it worsened it. Respiratory illnesses spread in cramped huts, where smoke from hearths irritated lungs. Colds, fevers, and pneumonia claimed many lives. Children especially succumbed quickly. Without modern medicine, treatment relied on herbs and folk remedies. Garlic, honey, and vinegar were prized. Hot poultices were placed on chests, and herbal teas sought to draw out illness. Village healers, often older women, were vital. Some new remedies passed down for generations, blending superstition with genuine herbal knowledge. They set bones, delivered babies, and fought illness with whatever tools they had. But suspicion lingered. A healer whose cures failed might be accused of witchcraft. Illness was seen as both natural and spiritual punishment for sin, or the work of evil forces. To survive winter disease was often less about cure than about sheer endurance. The monotony of darkness. For a medieval peasant, the greatest enemy in winter was not always hunger or cold but darkness itself. As the sun dipped early below the horizon, the world became cloaked in a near-total blackness, with no gas lamps, no street lights, and for most families not even the luxury of candles. Peasants lived by the dim glow of a central fire. That fire was precious, fed carefully so as not to waste fuel, tended constantly to ensure it did not die out, and yet always smoldering, smoky, and unreliable. Candles were rare luxuries, crafted from tallow-rendered animal fat or, for the wealthy, from beeswax. A peasant family might only afford a handful each year, reserved for religious festivals or emergencies. This meant that for the vast majority of long winter nights, the only illumination came from the hearth, casting flickering shadows on mud-plastered walls. The darkness was more than inconvenient, it was oppressive. It stretched out for 12, sometimes 14 hours a night. Families gathered close, whispering stories, knitting nets, or mending tools in near blindness. Children played by touch more than sight, their games quiet to avoid waking tired parents. Adults sat silently, listening to the crackling fire or the wind scratching at the wooden shutters. Darkness was also frightening. Beyond the thin wooden walls lay a void alive with superstition. Peasants believed winter nights teemed with spirits, demons, and the restless souls of the dead. Wolves howled in the distance, owls shrieked overhead, and every unexplained sound could be blamed on something supernatural. The line between real danger and imagined horror blurred in the long black hours. But darkness was not always the enemy. It brought intimacy. Families pressed close together, sharing warmth and whispers. Stories passed down from grandparents were retold, keeping oral traditions alive. Songs and prayers carried softly into the night. In many ways, the darkness forced people to connect not only with each other, but with their own fears, their own imaginations, and their own patience. Still, the endless night weighed heavily on the mind. Seasonal depression was not named then, but its effects were felt. The monotony of waiting, of seeing no sunlight for days on end through snowstorms, left peasants weary, listless, and sometimes hopeless. Darkness tested more than sight, it tested the soul. Community bonds and survival pacts. When winter stripped life to its harshest essentials, survival was not an individual affair, it was communal. No family, no matter how resourceful, could endure the season alone. Villages depended on a web of silent agreements, mutual aid, and unwritten rules that bound everyone together. If one family's grain ran low, a neighbor might lend a sack with the unspoken understanding it would be repaid after harvest. If a widow lacked firewood, the village might cut some for her, knowing that one day they too might need help. At first glance, these acts might look like generosity, but in truth, they were survival strategies. A village where neighbors allowed each other to die was a village that weakened itself. In times of crisis, every able-bodied person mattered. Every hand in the field, every body in the barn, every child who might grow to adulthood was part of the community's fragile balance. Peasants also shared labor. When snow blocked paths, men gathered together to clear them. When livestock barns needed repair, neighbors lent their tools. Even during hunger, communal feasts on holy days were maintained. Though meager, these gatherings reminded peasants that they were part of something larger, that suffering was shared, and therefore a little lighter. At the same time, the bonds of community were policed by the church. Priests reminded villagers constantly that charity was not merely kindness, but obligation. To refuse to help one's neighbor was to invite divine punishment. Sins of selfishness weighed heavily on the conscience, for heaven was the ultimate goal, and even a loaf of bread could determine eternal fate. Yet survival pacts were not purely spiritual, they were pragmatic. If you denied your neighbor help in January, They might refuse you aid in March when your own stores ran out. Cooperation was not optional, it was enforced by the quiet, unbreakable reality of shared survival. In winter, a village was not a collection of families, it was a single body. When one part weakened, the whole risked collapse. Winter travel and frozen roads. Though most peasants stayed rooted in their villages during the bitter months, sometimes winter demanded movement, and travel, in this season, was among the most dangerous acts of all. Roads that in summer were dusty and uneven became impassable. Heavy snow buried paths, and without markers, travelers quickly became lost. Where snow melted, roads became seas of mud, sucking wheels and hooves alike into sticky traps. Ice-covered rivers, sometimes creating shortcuts, sometimes creating deadly illusions. For peasants, travel was rarely a matter of choice. Perhaps a lord demanded that taxes be delivered despite the snow. Perhaps a messenger carried word of war, famine, or royal decree. Perhaps a desperate family needed to trade at a distant market to secure salt, tools, or medicine. Whatever the reason, travel in winter was less a journey than a gamble with fate. Sleds pulled by oxen or horses were the best means of hauling goods, gliding over packed snow where carts would fail. Poorer families fashioned crude sledges from planks, dragging loads by hand. Boots were stuffed with straw for insulation, but frostbite was common, leaving blackened toes and fingers as permanent reminders of each trip. And then there were the predators. Wolves prowled roadsides, their hunger driving them closer to villagers and travelers alike. Chronicles record attacks on lonely roads, when entire flocks or sleds of goods were devoured by desperate packs. Shelter was another hazard. Villages lay miles apart, and inns were luxuries along major routes, not country lanes. A traveler caught in a storm without refuge often froze to death before morning. Those who survived such nights carried the scars on their skin and minds forever. Travelers sought safety in monasteries, which were both spiritual havens and practical shelters. The hospitality of monks was legendary. Bread, ale, and warmth were given freely to weary souls. But not every traveler reached such walls in time. Thus, winter travel became a symbol of hardship itself, a reminder that survival was always a thin line between necessity and danger, between endurance and death. Hunger and the great starvations. If darkness was a test of the soul, and cold a test of the body, then hunger was the sharpest and most relentless enemy of all. Every winter brought the same dread question: would the food last? For some, the answer was yes. For many, it was no. When harvests were poor, granaries emptied too soon. Peasants stretched flour with sawdust, bark, or powdered roots, baking loaves that filled the stomach but poisoned the body. Meat was long gone, beans and lentils carefully rationed, and children cried themselves to sleep on bellies gnawed by hunger. Famine was not an abstraction, it was an annual threat. The Great Famine of the early 14th century scarred Europe so deeply that its stories lingered for centuries. Whole villages ate grass, weeds, or whatever roots they could find under frozen soil. Some chronicles hint darkly at cannibalism, at bodies dug from graves or children abandoned in forests. Whether all these accounts are true or exaggerated, the terror they carried was real. Hunger also reshaped morality. Theft of bread or grain in winter was not always greed, it was survival. Yet punishment could be brutal. Some peasants risked stealing from barns, knowing capture might mean mutilation or exile. Desperation eroded the thin veneer of law and order. Hunger, however, was not only physical, it was psychological. The gnawing emptiness became constant. Mothers wept as they fed their children scraps while starving themselves. Fathers despaired when their stores ran dry months too soon. The famine was not just in the fields, it was in every mind, every heart, every long night when spring seemed impossibly far. For peasants, hunger was not a disaster to be endured once in a lifetime, it was the shadow that haunted every single winter. Children's games in the cold. And yet, even in the shadow of famine and cold, children found ways to play. For the youngest, the snow was not only hardship, was magic. Children slid across frozen ponds, their laughter carrying through icy air. They chased each other with snowballs, made little figures from packed ice, or sculpted crude animals in the drifts. When snow was absent, play took other forms. Children carved sticks into toy plows, imitating their fathers. They herded chickens or geese in mock farming games. Pebbles became sheep, twigs became oxen, and scraps of cloth served as dolls. Inside the huts, games were quieter. String games, rhymes, and riddles filled the long hours of darkness. Songs taught by mothers and grandmothers kept traditions alive. Older children often played at storytelling themselves, repeating the tales they had overheard. Play was not meaningless. It was education disguised as fun. By mimicking chores, children learned the rhythms of adulthood. By singing songs, they absorbed history and culture. And in a world of constant hardship, their laughter gave parents a fleeting but powerful sense of hope. Winter was a season of suffering, but in the eyes of children, it was also a season of wonder. The frozen fields and silent earth, winter turned farmland into a graveyard. Where once the soil pulsed with life, green shoots, golden wheat, buzzing insects, it now lay still, blanketed under a suffocating quilt of snow. The furrows carved by summer's plows had vanished, the boundaries between fields erased by frost, as if the land itself had forgotten where one man's plot ended and another's began. For medieval peasants, this silence was both reprieve and torment. On one hand, the endless back-breaking work of plowing, sowing, and weeding ceased. The fields did not demand their constant labor. Their aching backs found brief rest. Yet that same stillness also meant helplessness. There was no planting to be done, no way to coax food from the earth. Winter was the season of waiting, of trusting that the harvest stored in barns would carry them through until spring. But fields in winter were not truly abandoned. Peasants trudged across them to gather firewood, to cut branches from hedges, or to check for signs of animals. Rabbits burrowed under hedgerows, hares left tracks across the snow. Sometimes the frozen ground revealed its own secret stones unearthed by frost, to be collected for mending walls come spring. The earth itself seemed to breathe differently. Frost crept across every surface, coating twigs in crystal lace. Frozen streams groaned under the weight of snow. The wind scoured the fields, howling as if the land itself were crying out in hunger. Superstition lingered over these frozen fields. Peasants believed that winter was when evil spirits had freer reign. Witches were said to walk the barren fields at night, whispering curses into the soil to ruin the next harvest. Shadows stretched strangely in the pale moonlight, and every flicker on the snow might be interpreted as a ghost or demon passing by. Yet, despite the fear, peasants could not ignore the fields. They walked across them daily, looking out at the stark whiteness, measuring with their eyes how much longer they must endure before life returned. The silent earth was both reminder and promise, that suffering was temporary, but also that survival required patience beyond measure. The sounds of winter nights. If you closed your eyes in a medieval village on a winter's night, what would you hear? The first sound would be the fire crackling, hissing as damp wood steamed. Sometimes it spat sparks, startling those dozing near it. The fire was both comfort and menace. It warmed, but it also threatened to consume the thatch above if neglected. Next, the wind. It slithered through every crack in the walls, whistled through the shutters, rattled loose planks. At times it howled like a living beast, rising to a shriek that made children clutch their mothers in fear. Peasants gave voices to these winds, naming them spirits or demons roaming outside. Beyond the wind came the sounds of animals. Cows lowing in the barns, restless with cold. Chickens muttering softly, feathers rustling. Dogs barking suddenly, their voices sharp against the muffled snow. Such barks could mean anything: a fox prowling, a wolf lurking, or simply the dog dreaming. And then there were the silences. Deep, heavy silences that pressed against the ears until even the beating of one's own heart seemed loud. In those silences, imagination ran wild. Was that a footstep outside? The crunch of snow? The creak of the door shifting? Darkness magnified every noise, and every silence. At times, the silence broke in terrifying ways. A distant howl of wolves carried across the hills, echoing through the village until every child sat upright. Sometimes, bells from a faraway church told mocking midnight prayers or the passing of a soul into death. Yet winter nights were not always menacing. Songs carried softly in cottages, voices weaving hymns or folk tunes. Mothers hummed lullabies. Fathers whispered stories of saints, giants, or battles long past. These gentle sounds stitched warmth into the cold. Thus the soundscape of winter nights was a paradox. At once soothing and terrifying, filled with comfort and dread. It was a world where every creak mattered, every howl threatened, and every silence spoke louder than words. Clothing and the armor of warmth. How did peasants protect themselves from the killing cold? Not with fur-lined cloaks or elegant wool coats, but with a patchwork of whatever scraps they could muster. The foundation was linen undergarments sewn from rough flax fibers, worn year-round, even in winter. Over these came woolen tunics, often coarse and itchy, but durable. Wool was the peasant's true defense, its natural oils resisting moisture, its thickness trapping precious heat. In the coldest months, peasants layered endlessly. Old garments were not discarded but repurposed, patched into cloaks, sewn into linings, cut into strips for bindings. Leather, when affordable, provided further protection. Boots stiff with wear, gloves made from animal hides. Those without leather wrapped their feet in cloths, stuffing them with straw for insulation. Head coverings were essential. Hoods, caps, or even simple cloth wrappings kept heat from escaping. A bare head in winter was unthinkable, even indoors. Peasants often wore caps. For those lucky enough to keep sheep, wool was a blessing. Sheep provided not only meat and milk, but the fleece that could be spun and woven. Women spent long winter nights spinning wool by the fire, fingers numb but determined, for every thread might become the difference between warmth and frostbite. The wealthy flaunted furfox rabbit, even ermine but for peasants. Fur was survival, not fashion. A rabbit pelt might be stitched into a muff or a fox skin used as a shawl, but most wore none at all. Clothing was never wasted. When too tattered for wear, garments were cut into patches. When beyond patching, they were unraveled for thread. Even rags had purpose. Stuffing for boots, wicks for lamps, padding for wounds. To a medieval peasant, clothing was armor not against swords or arrows, but against the far deadlier enemy of cold. Every layer was a shield, every thread a prayer. Winter illness and the healer's struggles. Cold did not only sap strength, it bred illness. And in villages with no physicians, only folk healers and superstition stood between peasants and death. Respiratory sickness was rampant. Smoke-filled cottages, damp with poor ventilation, bred coughs that lingered for months. Bronchitis, pneumonia, and influenza swept through families. A simple cold could prove fatal when combined with hunger and frost. Fevers terrified peasants. A child burning with heat in the dead of winter was seen as cursed, perhaps struck by a witch or punished by God. Remedies varied. Herbal teas brewed from dried plants, poultices of onions or garlic, prayers whispered over the sick. Some healers recommended hanging charms above doors to ward off illness, or burning certain woods to drive out malevolent spirits. Rats and fleas carried unseen killers. Plague still flickered across Europe, its outbreaks sporadic but devastating. Typhus, spread by lice, also lurked in winter when peasants huddled together for warmth. Medicine was as much ritual as science. Healers traced crosses on foreheads, muttered incantations, or applied strange concoctions, ashes, mixed with honey, dried frog powder, or bloodletting by leeches. Some of these did nothing, others made matters worse. But they offered hope, and hope itself was medicine of a kind. Yet peasants had resilience. Many endured sickness and recovered with nothing but time and stubbornness. Children who survived harsh winters emerged hardier, their bodies forged in suffering. Still, illness was feared above all. Hunger could be endured, cold resisted, but disease struck invisibly, stealing loved ones in silence. And in winter, when every resource was scarce, sickness felt like the final cruelty of a season already laden with suffering. Faith, fear, and the church's winter grip. Religion did not pause for winter, it deepened. In the darkest months, when the world felt cursed by cold and hunger, faith became both weapon and refuge. The church calendar was thick with holy days that punctuated the gloom. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany each brought brief relief from toil, with feasts, prayers, and candle-lit masses. For peasants, these were not only spiritual occasions, but opportunities for joy, a shared meal, a cup of ale, a flicker of music in the dark. Yet faith was also infused with fear. Priests preached that winter suffering was a test from God, a reminder of man's sinfulness. Famine, illness, and death were divine punishments or warnings. The church urged confession, fasting, and penance. To endure without complaint was to earn heaven's favor. Superstition blended seamlessly with Christian teaching. Spirits in the snow were demons, sickness was the devil's work. Unseasonable storms were signs of God's wrath. The faithful clutched charms, relics, or blessed tokens for protection. Monasteries stood as beacons of hope. There, monks distributed bread, offered shelter, and prayed for the souls of the suffering. For peasants, the sight of a monastery's glowing windows in the night was like a vision of paradise. But faith also bound peasants to endurance. The promise of eternal salvation gave them strength to face the cold, hunger, and death. Suffering was sanctified. It was not meaningless, but a step toward God. Thus, in winter's grip, the church's voice was louder than ever. Every bell, every chant, Every flicker of candlelight reminded peasants that though the world outside was frozen, heaven above burned warm and eternal. The frozen water and the struggle for drink. It is easy to imagine food as the central struggle of winter, but for peasants, water could be just as difficult. Streams and wells froze solid, and the simple act of drinking became another daily trial. Wells were lifelines, yet, in the coldest stretches of January, their surfaces iced over. Villagers hacked at the ice with iron tools, shattering it to reach the black water beneath. Buckets lowered came up with slush, not liquid, and children were often tasked with carrying heavy half-frozen water back home. Each trip was exhausting, each spill costly. Rivers and streams posed both danger and salvation. Some villagers cut holes into frozen rivers, pulling water from beneath the ice, but the edges were slippery, treacherous. A misstep could plunge a body into freezing water. Few survived such accidents. Even standing too close risked frostbite as icy mist clung to skin and clothes. For many, melted snow became the answer. Women filled pots with packed snow, setting them near the fire to melt. But snow was deceptive. What looked like a full pot of sustenance melted into only a trickle of water. The constant need to collect snow meant endless trips outdoors, shivering with every step. Water was not just for drinking, it was needed to cook, to brew ale, to wash. Villagers without sufficient sources faced filth building up in winter huts. Clothes went unwashed, bodies unbathed, infections spreading in the damp air. Medieval people already bathed rarely, but in winter it became near impossible. Some villagers relied heavily on ale weak, watery, and brewed at home as a safer alternative to contaminated water. Even children drank it, for fermentation killed many of the unseen dangers. But brewing required grain, itself precious, and not every family could afford to spare it. Thus, winter thirst was not simply a matter of inconvenience. It was another quiet, grinding, trial hauling, hacking, melting, rationing. Every sip was earned, and every drop a reminder that even water, the most basic of needs, turned hostile when the world froze. Winter work and the crafts of survival. Though fields lay barren, peasants were never idle. Winter shifted the rhythm of work but did not erase it. If anything, the season intensified the labor of survival. Men turned to repairing tools and equipment. Wooden plows, carts, yokes, and harrows were inspected and mended by firelight. Axes were sharpened, handles were fitted, iron tools were forged by the village blacksmith. Every winter evening echoed with the sound of scraping, hammering, and sawing. These tasks were not leisure, they were preparation, ensuring survival when spring's planting returned. Women spun wool endlessly. Sheep shearing was done in warmer months, but winter was when raw fleece was washed, carded, and spun into thread. The rhythm of the spinning wheel filled cottages, the hum of fiber turning to yarn as hands worked tirelessly. Woven cloth was mended, new garments stitched. Every hour of spinning was an investment in warmth. Children joined this rhythm too. They twisted straw into ropes, plucked feathers for bedding, and gathered kindling from woods. Even the smallest pair of hands was expected to contribute, for winter was merciless toward idleness. Crafts also flourished in this season. Basket weaving, wood carving, leatherworking each provided tools or goods to trade when spring markets reopened. The village carpenter shaped handles for hoes and shovels, while cobblers stitched new soles onto worn boots. For those with no land or animals, winter work often meant service. Poor peasants offered themselves as hired hands, chopping wood for wealthier neighbors, tending animals or shoveling paths. Payment might come in food, not coin, but in famine years, even crusts of bread were worth the labor. Winter work was more than practical. It was psychological armor. To be busy was to stave off despair. The clatter of tools, the hum of spinning, the chatter of hands at work, they kept minds from dwelling too deeply on hunger and cold. Thus, the crafts of winter were not merely chores. They were lifelines, keeping both body and spirit moving forward, when the world outside seemed determined to crush both. Wolves, boars, and the beasts of winter. The forests surrounding medieval villages were home to dangers that grew bolder in winter. Hunger drove beasts from the trees into fields, roads, and even the outskirts of settlements. Wolves were the most dreaded. Lean and desperate, packs prowled the snowy edges of villages, their yellow eyes glinting in torchlight. Children fetching water were warned never to walk alone. Stories of wolf attacks spread like wildfire. Wolves targeted sheep, goats, and sometimes even weak cattle on bitter nights. Their howls carried for miles, chilling the blood of every listener. Boars were another threat. Though less common, a starving wild boar was more dangerous than wolves, charging with tusks that could kill a man outright. Peasants armed with spears sometimes hunted them in groups, but in deep snow, even seasoned hunters risked death. Foxes and weasels plagued henhouses, slipping under doors to steal chickens. Their cunning became infamous, fueling folk tales of trickster animals outwitting humans. While wolves symbolized terror, foxes symbolized deceit. And then there were bears, though rarer by the later Middle Ages, in harsher climates. Stories lingered of great beasts emerging from their dens too early, prowling for food. Whether true or not, the tales kept peasants wary of forests in winter. These predators shaped village behavior. Fires were kept burning near barns to deter wolves. Fences were reinforced with thorny brush. Watchdogs were treasured companions, their barks serving as the first line of defense. But fear was not only practical, it was spiritual. Wolves were often seen as agents of the devil, embodiments of sin and hunger. Priests preached of wolves as punishments for wickedness, while folklore spoke of shapeshifters, men cursed to walk as wolves until redeemed. To medieval peasants, winter was not only a battle with cold but with the animal world itself. Every howl, every broken fence, every missing goat was a reminder that survival meant defending against beasts who, like humans, were starving for life. Firewood and the fuel of survival. No struggle in winter was as constant as the battle for fuel. Firewood was not luxury, it was life. Without it, food could not be cooked, water could not be melted, frost could not be driven from homes. Gathering wood was exhausting. Men trudged into forests, axes heavy on their shoulders, boots sinking into snow, cutting trees in bitter cold numbed hands, and froze sweat against skin. Every log hauled back was a victory. Children followed, dragging branches or twigs, while women gathered brush and deadfall for kindling. But wood was finite. Lords often restricted peasants from cutting in forests, claiming the trees as their property. Peasants risked fines or worse for stealing branches from noble woods. Thus, many were forced to scour hedges, marshes, and even dung heaps for fuel substitutes. Dried dung, peat, or straw bound with mud became poor man's firewood. They smoked terribly, but they burned. Inside cottages, firewood was rationed carefully. The hearth was the heart of the home, but it could not blaze unchecked. Fires were banked at night, covered with ash to smolder until morning. Children were warned never to let flames die completely. Relighting them without flint was laborious, sometimes impossible. The poor often faced agonizing choices: burn less wood and shiver, or burn more and risk starvation when supplies ran out before spring. Many chose the former, huddling together for warmth while the fire shrank to embers. Firewood shaped the rhythms of daily life. The sound of splitting logs echoed across villages. Piles of wood outside cottages were a visible sign of wealth or lack of it. A family with a high stack was envied, one with none was pitied. And beyond necessity, firewood carried symbolism. Fire was warmth, safety, community. It was the place where stories were told, songs sung, prayers whispered. To lose fire was not just to risk death, it was to lose the very heart of life. Winter dreams and the longing for spring. In the depths of winter, when night stretched endlessly and hunger gnawed without mercy, peasants clung to one thing above all: dreams of spring. They imagined green shoots pushing through thawing soil, birds returning to hedges, fields alive with buzzing life. In their minds, the warmth of the sun became almost mythical, a paradise of light and color beyond the gray. Children asked constantly, "When will the flowers return? When can we play outside again?" These dreams were more than idle fantasy, they were survival. Stories of spring kept spirits alive in the dark. Parents told tales of the first plowing, of lambs born in fresh straw, of festivals that welcomed warmth back to the earth. Songs carried promises that no winter lasted forever. Hope was woven into practical acts too. Even as they shivered, peasants prepared seed for planting, stored carefully against damp and rot. They repaired plows, mended harnesses, spun yarn for lighter garments. Every act said, "Spring will come, and we must be ready." But winter dreams were tinged with fear. What if the harvest failed? What if the soil lay barren? What if the famine never ended? These questions haunted long nights. To dream of spring was both comfort and torment, a reminder of what was possible, but also what might never come. And yet, year after year, peasants endured. They dreamed, they hoped, they sang, they prayed. Winter crushed their bodies, but never quite their spirits. For as long as they could imagine the warmth of spring, they could survive the cold of the present, hunger and the bitterest famine foods. By midwinter, granaries thinned, and hunger sharpened into desperation. For many peasants, this was the season of famine, foods things eaten not because they nourished, but because they kept the stomach from screaming. Acorns were gathered, boiled and leached of bitterness, though even then they were hard on the gut. Bark was stripped from trees, ground into powder, and mixed with flour to stretch bread into pitifully thin loaves. In times of true desperation, peasants chewed on boiled nettles, dandelion roots, or grass. Rats, mice, and crows became prey, trapped and roasted over coals. Though considered unclean, hunger eroded every taboo. Bones were cracked open for marrow. Dogs and cats sometimes vanished mysteriously, consumed in secret when children cried too loudly from hunger. Bread, the staple of peasant life, changed drastically in famine. Loaves were padded with sawdust, husks, or ground-up weeds. They filled the belly but brought sickness. Monks wrote of starvation bread, so black and bitter it could hardly be called food. Yet it was eaten with trembling hands. Such diets left peasants weak, their bodies gaunt, their children swollen with malnutrition. Fevers spread faster among the underfed. A bad cough, a small wound, a bout of diarrhea became death sentences when the body was starved. Famine was not just physical, it was psychological torment. Families counted kernels of grain, argued over who deserved the last crust, whispered about neighbors who had food hidden away. Trust frayed, suspicion grew, and sometimes villagers turned upon themselves. And yet, famine also revealed astonishing endurance. Mothers went hungry so children could eat. Villagers shared pitiful scraps in acts of mercy. Hunger revealed cruelty, but it also revealed solidarity, humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender, even in the face of bitter emptiness. Festivals of midwinter, joy in the darkest time. Even amid hunger and cold, medieval villagers carved out moments of joy. Festivals punctuated the long darkness, binding communities together in ritual and celebration. Christmas was the greatest of these, stretching over 12 days of feasting, song, and worship. For peasants, it was a time of brief relief, when lords often distributed meat, bread, and ale. The village church glowed with candles, choirs sang, and for a few days, the harshness of survival gave way to joy. But older, pagan traditions lingered beneath Christian feasts. Yule logs burned through the night, symbolizing the triumph of light over darkness. Villagers sang carols at doors, receiving gifts of food in return. Mummers performed plays, their costumes crude but spirited, retelling stories of saints, devils, and fools. Twelfth Night brought chaos and laughter. Lords of misrule were crowned peasants or servants who, for a single day, mocked authority, leading dances, games, and pranks. Even in poverty, laughter echoed through villages, a bomb against despair. Candlemas in early February marked another turning point, the slow return of light. Candles were blessed and distributed, their flickering flames a promise that spring would come again. For children, festivals were the rare taste of abundance. Honey cakes, roasted apples, or sugared nuts appeared. Fleeting delights savored as if they were treasure. For adults, it was a reminder of community, the strength of shared song, shared laughter, shared faith. Festivals did not erase suffering, but they gave it rhythm. They reminded peasants that life was not only toil and hunger, but also dance, music, and faith. In the heart of winter's cruelty, these celebrations gave people the strength to keep enduring. Illness in the frost, winter's silent killer. Winter was not only about hunger and cold, it was a season of sickness. Illness stalked villages in the damp, smoky huts where families huddled together. Pneumonia and bronchitis spread quickly. Coughs echoed through cottages, turning into rattling breaths. Without medicine, many faded quietly in bed, their fevers unbroken. Children were the most vulnerable, their tiny chests struggling against infection. Frostbite took toes and fingers, blackening flesh until it dropped away. Some peasants learned to live maimed, limping through life with hands too crippled to work. Others succumbed to the infections that followed. The flu, measles, and other fevers found winter a perfect breeding ground. Cramped living quarters, poor ventilation, and malnourished bodies meant sickness swept through entire villages. Priests prayed over the dead while neighbors dug shallow graves into frozen ground. Treatment was crude. Herbal teas, poultices of onion or garlic, whispered charms against spirits. These were the remedies of peasants. Bloodletting, sometimes attempted, often weakened patients further. The healer's hut was a place of both hope and despair. Disease carried spiritual weight as well. Illness was often seen as punishment for sin, or as the devil's hand upon the village. Pilgrimages were promised if the sick recovered. Candles were lit before saint statues. Winter sickness left deep scars. Families mourned empty beds, villages shrank in size, and survivors carried fear of every cough. Yet still they endured, clinging to the fragile hope that spring would bring not only warmth, but healing. Children in the cold. The struggle of the young. For medieval children, winter was both wonder and terror. Snow brought games sliding on frozen ponds, throwing clumps of ice, building crude figures from frost. Laughter echoed briefly across the frozen fields. But behind the play lay harsh reality. Children's bodies, small and weak, struggled to keep warm. They lacked proper clothing, their shoes often thin, patched with scraps of leather. Frostbite took them first. Illness stole them quickly. Infant mortality soared in winter. Food was rationed carefully for children, but in times of famine they often ate less than adults. Mothers wept as they shared their portions, watching children nibble on scraps. Malnutrition left them frail, stunted, and vulnerable. Yet children were not spared from work. They carried wood, fetched water, helped spin wool, and tended animals. Even the youngest were expected to endure, to contribute to the survival of the family. Their laughter mixed with labor, their games cut short by exhaustion. Folklore became a shield for them. Parents told tales by the fire, stories of animals that spoke, of saints who protected children, of magical springs that thawed frozen fields. In the bleakness, imagination kept young minds alive. Winter for children was both cruel and formative. Those who survived carried the memories of cold into adulthood, shaping their resilience. For them, winter was a teacher of hardship, endurance, and the fragile miracle of survival. Faith in the frost, God, the saints, and the cold. When all else failed, peasants turned to faith. In winter's depth, prayer was as vital as food or fire. Church bells rang in frozen air, summoning villagers to huddle together in stone chapels lit by flickering candles. Priests preached of endurance, of Christ's suffering mirrored in their own, of heaven's warmth awaiting the faithful. Saints became powerful protectors. Saint Blaise was invoked against sore throats, Saint Roch against plague, Saint Bridget for healing and warmth. Candles were blessed, holy water sprinkled, charms worn beneath clothes to ward off frost and disease. Famine and sickness were often explained as God's testing, a trial of faith. Survival meant not only enduring but believing. To curse God was dangerous, risking damnation as well as despair. Yet faith also brought community. Pilgrimages were promised in spring, prayers said together in cottages, hymns sung as snow fell, shared belief bound villagers in ways that no lord or law could match. Faith, like fire, was survival. It gave meaning to suffering, purpose to endurance, and hope to lives otherwise buried in frost. To medieval peasants, God's warmth was the one flame that never truly went out, the frozen silence of death. As the deep heart of winter pressed on, the stillness of villages was sometimes broken only by the toll of a church bell. Death was an ever-present companion, stalking the weakest, the sickly, the old, and even the strongest men worn down by hunger. Burying the dead in winter was itself an ordeal. The ground froze like iron, and shovels bent or broke against it. Gravediggers often had to light fires on the earth for hours just to thaw a patch large enough to receive a body. Sometimes, when snow lay thick and the soil too stubborn, bodies were stored in barns, wrapped in cloths, and laid upon straw until spring thaw made burial possible. Funerals were simple. The poor could not afford coffins. Bodies were rolled in linen or even simple sacks and lowered directly into the earth. Villagers prayed together, their breath visible in the cold air, their tears freezing on their faces. For survivors, grief mingled with fear. Each death reminded them of their own fragility. A child taken by fever made every cough sound more dangerous. An elder lost to hunger made every growling stomach seem closer to the grave. Yet there was also resilience. Songs were sung, candles lit, and prayers offered not only for the departed, but for those who remained. In death, communities often grew tighter, clinging together against the cold void. The silence of death was chilling, but it was also a reminder of life's preciousness. The long wait for spring. By February, the hunger season reached its peak. Food stores were nearly gone, clothing was ragged, and tempers frayed. But there was also something new in the era: restless anticipation. The days grew slightly longer, birds returned, their calls cutting through the cold silence. Icicles began to drip, and streams cracked open from beneath their frozen shells. Peasants watched these signs closely, whispering, "Spring is coming." Work shifted toward readiness. Tools were repaired, plows sharpened, and oxen prepared for the heavy labor of breaking frozen soil once it softened. Children gathered the last of the firewood, knowing soon the woods would echo again with life. Hope was fragile but powerful. Families spoke of planting, of harvests to come, of better food than famine bred. Couples who had postponed weddings during the harshest cold now began to plan again, for spring was the season of unions and renewal. Still, winter made sure not to release its grip easily. Sudden storms swept in, undoing weeks of thaw. Crops planted too early were killed by frost. The fear of a false spring haunted peasants' hope betrayed was crueler than despair. The wait for spring was therefore a balancing act between endurance and impatience, between faith and fear. For peasants, surviving winter was not a sudden victory, but a gradual transition, marked by the cautious, desperate belief that better days might actually come. Lessons written in ice. What did medieval peasants truly learn from winters that tested every fiber of their being? For one, they learned humility against the elements. Human strength alone was nothing. All the toil, all the effort, meant little if the harvest failed or snow fell too deep. Winter reminded them of their smallness. They learned resilience. Each family that endured proved that humans could withstand extremes that might seem unbearable. Their methods layered clothing, shared fires, preservation of food, and reliance on neighbors were not luxuries but necessities crafted by centuries of survival. They also learned solidarity. In winter, no peasant survived alone. Families shared firewood, villagers pooled food, neighbors watched over children when parents fell ill. The cold punished isolation, but it rewarded community, and perhaps most importantly, they learned faith not always in God alone, but in the promise of cycles. Winter always seemed endless, but spring always returned. Crops grew again, children laughed again, songs were sung again. This certainty that the darkness would pass was what kept peasants alive in the bitterest of months. For us today, warm in our modern comforts, it's easy to look back and wonder how anyone survived such brutal winters without insulated homes, medicine, or steady food. But for medieval peasants, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned, painfully, with every frozen morning and every hungry night. Their lives remind us that survival is not only about strength, it's about endurance, adaptation, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow will be better than today. So, would you have survived a medieval winter? Imagine no central heating, no supermarkets, no medicine, just a smoky hut, a dwindling pile of firewood, and your own determination. If this deep dive into the harsh, fascinating survival of medieval peasants kept you hooked, then you're exactly the kind of curious mind we built this channel for. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed the journey, because it helps more history lovers find it. Subscribe to join our growing community where we uncover the brutal, bizarre, and hidden sides of history every week. And hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story, from forgotten torture devices to strange medieval laws, and everything in between. Winter was cruel, life was fragile, but the peasants endured. Now, so have you, through hours of history most people never hear. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, the past is never as boring as they told you.